Hello and welcome to the X Point YouTube channel. Today we have a top 4 match from X Point 17, tournament that took place online in June of 2022. We have Rob, who's going to play a black-green Ponza deck, versus Jorgo, who's on a blue-white control. As always, if you want to skip the introduction and the deck text and jump straight to the games, you can do that using the timestamps in the description or the chapter markers on the video. As a refresher, X Points is an old-school Magic variant that uses the Atlantic rule set as well as a point system. Players in this tournament were allowed to spend up to 10 points on the cards you see on your screen. And today's match is a good one between two of the most dominant decks in the format, and it will determine who enters the finals of X Point 17. So let's go to the deck text. First up, we have the deck of Rob, who's playing a black-green Ponza deck. We saw this deck last week in his top 8 match. The goal of this deck is pretty straightforward. He wants to attack his opponent's lands using Ice Storm and Sinkhole, and also attack his opponent's hand using Hymn to Turak and Hypnotic Spectre. And once the opponent is out of resources, he finishes the game off with an Urnum Djinn or a Sender Vampire. He's using Paralyze for removal, which, if you remember, makes the opponent pay 4 mana to untap their creature, and often between the hand and land destruction, the opponent just simply doesn't have 4 mana to untap their creature. So Paralyze was very good last week, and we'll see if it's equally as good this week. Rob has spent his points on a Mox Jet for that turn 1 Sinkhole or Hymn to Turak, a Regrowth to get back one of those spells, 3 Mishra's Factories, and 4 Hymn to Turaks. As far as sideboard options, in this match I could see Rob bringing in a Tsunami, a Gloom, the 2 Terrors, which will be almost strict upgrades to the Paralyzes, and possibly the Chains of Mistopheles to turn off Jorgo's Jayemdae Tomes. That's maybe a stretch and maybe not what he intended, but I'm curious to see what he does. Okay, let's take a look at the deck of Jorgo. Jorgo's playing a very standard blue-white control deck. His goal is to trade 1-for-1 with his opponent using Counterspell, Disenchant, and Swords to Plowshares, while also using his 3 main deck Maze of Iths to force his opponent to commit more than 1 creature to the board, at which point he can cast Wrath of God and get a 2-for-1, or 3-for-1, or maybe even a 4-for-1. And he's going to refill his hand using the Jayemdae Tomes and a Brain Geyser so that trading 1-for-1 is worse for his opponent than it is for him. Jorgo is also running 4 Deserts, which is very good in X Points. It kills all of the Orders, it kills Scrib Sprites, it kills Landwar Elves and Argothian Pixies. Against Rob's deck, he doesn't have a lot of 1 toughness creatures, so I'm not sure how effective they'll be. On the other hand, if he gets all 4 of them out in a long game, he can theoretically kill a Sender Vampire. Jorgo's going to finish the game with Serra Angel or Azure Drake, and it's worth noting that he elected to play Azure Drake over something like Serendib Ifrit. Even though the Ifrit costs 1 less and has 1 more power, it also damages you, and Jorgo is expecting to play a long game here, so that damage can really add up over time. The Azure Drake does most of the work while avoiding most of the cost of the Serendib Ifrit, so I think that's why he went that route. Jorgo spent his points on Soul Ring to power out his Tomes and Angels faster, a Brain Geyser to refill his hand, making the 1-for-1 trades less painful, a Recall to turn late-game lands into late-game answers, and 4 Mazes of Ith, 3 in the main, 1 in the board, which will force Rob to overcommit his creatures to the board. As far as sideboard goes, I'm not really sure what Jorgo will bring in. Probably the 4th Maze, since Rob has so much land destruction. I could also see him bringing in the 2 Power Sinks and the Wrath of God. It's not so much that those are good, as much as the disenchants are kind of bad, and he probably doesn't need all 8 creatures, given that Rob only has 4 removal spells. We'll see if he's able to suss that out during game 1. So speaking of the games, let's go to the match. Okay, game number 1. The players are shuffling up and drawing their initial 7s. Jorgo will get to go first because he was higher seeded after the group stages of this tournament. Looks like both players are keeping their 7, and Jorgo starts off with a Desert. Rob has a turn 1 Elf, so the Desert might get some value here, assuming Jorgo doesn't use it for mana. And that's assuming Rob doesn't want to use the Elf for mana. So Jorgo plays a Felwar Stone, hoping to power out one of his 4-drops, which lets Rob attack with that Elf should he choose to. Looks like he is taking first blood of the match, and he has a Strip Mine for Jorgo's Tundra. So he's already destroyed one of Jorgo's lands and hasn't even needed to use one of his signature land destruction spells. Jorgo strips back, killing the forest of Rob, leaving him landless. This slows the game down quite a bit, but remember, Jorgo is hoping to play a long game, so that's not really a problem for him. Rob plays a Mishra's Factory, which keeps Jorgo's Felwar Stone offline, at least for now. Unfortunately, the maze and the desert are going to keep back all of Rob's creatures. There's a City of Brass that turns on the Felwar Stone, and an Urnum Djinn comes down from Rob. So the maze will be able to keep the Urnum at bay, but Rob should be able to get in with maybe the factory or some of the elves if he so chooses to throw them into the desert. So Rob has regrowthed his strip mine, and I'm not sure if he jumped ahead or Jorgo was distracted, but Jorgo eventually counters the regrowth there, so he will keep all of his lands for the time being. And Jorgo is thinking, tapping 4 mana for an Azure Drake. So the Maze of Ith can hold back the Urnum, and the Azure Drake is going to hold back the rest of the team, unfortunately. It's going to be very hard for Rob to do damage through Jorgo's board. And that's Jorgo's plan. Remember, he's probably holding a Wrath of God, or he hopes to draw into one. And in that case, he's going to 2 for 3 at least right now. Rob's board. There's a Hypnotic Spectre. All right. Again, the Hippie will be held back by the Azure Drake. Jorgo does what Blue Eye does and just plays draw go. Rob has a Paralyze for the Azure Drake, tapping it, which will let him get in with the team for at least one turn. Though Jorgo still does have the Maze of Ith. He's going to take 1 to use an elf to activate the factory and swing with Factory, Urnum, and Hippie. Jorgo has a Disenchant for the factory, mazes the Hippie, and looks like he will just take 4? Unless he has a Swords. Nope, he's going to take 4, fall to 15. And Jorgo has a Disenchant for the Paralyze end step, so his Azure Drake gets to untap, can keep that Hippie at bay for as long as he wants. Jorgo Brain Geysers for 3, refilling his hand. This is what we were talking about in the deck tech. Jorgo doesn't care that he's been trading 1 for 1, because Rob has now 3 cards in his hand, and Jorgo has at least 3 from the Brain Geyser, presumably more. There's an Ice Storm on the Maze of Ith, which lets the Urnum get in. Jorgo blocks with the Drake, so that definitely smells like Wrath of God here. And indeed it was. Jorgo wraths away the board. That's a 4 for 1. So Brain Geyser is a 3 for 1. Wrath was a 4 for 1. Jorgo is running away with the card advantage in this game. And Jorgo has a Disenchant for the factory. So maybe forget what I said about the Disenchants being bad in the deck tech. When your opponent is playing factories, Disenchant is never that bad. Jorgo has a Tome. Rob tries to crumble it, and Jorgo has a Counterspell. Left that 2 blue up. Probably waited deliberately to have 6 mana before playing the Tome. And now he just passes the turn. Rob plays a Hypnotic Spectre. Jorgo draws with the Tome. So Tome versus Spectre will even out. That's assuming Jorgo cannot immediately deal with the Spectre, which, given the number of answers in his deck, he probably can. He has it right there, a Counterspell. I guess he was toming in response to the spell being cast. Plays another Felwar Stone and still has 2 blue mana up for Counterspell. A full grip of cards. It's looking good for Jorgo. Rob is down to 1 card. He has 10 life, so he could presumably draw 2 cards with the Sylvan Library. Especially against a slow deck like Jorgo's, but it looks like the Chaos Orb is not even going to give Rob that option. Rob untaps, hymns away Jorgo's last card, which was also a Counterspell, so Jorgo is super protected. There's a Sarah Angel, so Jorgo has had enough messing around and is looking to close out the game. There's a Paralyze from Rob, but since Jorgo has, 10 mana? It's not really going to matter. He can Paralyze all day long. There's an Azure Drake that puts Rob dead on board, and he knows it. Didn't have an answer. We're going to move on to game number 2. Okay, game number 2 here. Both players drawing their initial 7 cards. Rob will be on the play. He starts with a Pendelhaven into an Elves of Deep Shadow. So that Pendelhaven would protect against the desert, but it won't protect against that maze. Rob is going to tap the elf and a swamp to him, Jorgo. Working on that hand destruction. Gets rid of a tundra and a disenchant, so Jorgo did leave the disenchants in. Rob reset his life, but didn't take 1 point from the elf, so hopefully they catch that. And there he goes. As he takes one this turn, he remembers, takes one. And Rob has a sinkhole, so his plan of hemming and sinkholing seems to be going much better this game than it did last game. He's ultimately going to sinkhole the maze, so he's less worried about Jorgo having mana as he is about Jorgo just having that free, basically icy manipulator. And now we can see why he has a Hypnotic Spectre. If Jorgo does not have a swords, that hippie is going to go to work on Jorgo's hand. And an Ice Storm on the desert. And now Rob can get in for 3. That hippie discards a book. Jorgo drops another plains. He is noticeably short blue mana here, so hemming away that Tundra may have been very good this game. Rob with another Ice Storm, keeping Jorgo on 2 mana. There's a Felwar Stone, bringing him up to 4. So, if Rob lets him have all of his mana, he could theoretically Wrath of God next turn. Rob has to keep that in mind. But he has a Crumble for the Felwar Stone. And swings in for 4. Or there's the swords on the hippie, so Jorgo can finally protect his hand. But he's already down to 10, so swings for 2 with the elves and then casts an Ice Storm. Jorgo has a Maze of Ith, but still only 2 mana, so whatever the last card in his hand is, it's unlikely he can cast it, but there's a Soul Ring, which will let him cast a Wrath of God. Rob is ready again with the Crumble. He knows his plan. Keep Jorgo off as much mana as he can. Rob swings with the elf. He chooses not to pump one with the Pendelhaven so that he can play Sendra Vampire. So he swings with the team. Jorgo mazes the Vampire. Rob can pump one elf with the Pendelhaven, and he can do it again the following turn. So he takes game number 2. He was able to use land and hand destruction to keep Jorgo off enough resources. So we're moving on to game number 3. Okay, we are into game number 3, and Rob is going to mulligan down to 6 cards. He's going to think long and hard about which one to put on the bottom. Mulliganing is always dangerous, but it is especially bad against a deck like Jorgo's that's just trying to out-card advantage you in the first place. Rob starts with a City of Brass, Mox Jet, and a turn 1 Sinkhole, so that's exactly why Rob is playing the Mox Jet. Moxes don't see a whole lot of play in X Point. They're generally not worth the 2 points in your deck, but in a deck like Rob's where he's trying to keep people off mana from turn 1, it can be surprisingly good. Jorgo just has a Desert and a Maze, while Rob plays a Sylvan Library and immediately takes all 3 cards, so it pays 8 life. He feels he has some breathing room against a deck like Jorgo's that's not putting a lot of pressure on him. Unfortunately, Rob does have 2 Cities of Brass, so he's damaging himself more so than Jorgo's damaging him, or could ever hope to. And the City of Brass does turn on that Felwar Stone. So Rob just takes 1 card this time, sinkholes the maze so that his hippie can get in. But fortunately for Jorgo, he has the Swords to Plowshares, swordsing the hippie. He'll still take 2 from a Pendelhaven Elf. And there's Rob with the Crumble on the Felwar Stone. And Jorgo comes up with his second maze of the game, so be able to keep that elf back, even though Rob has the Pendelhaven to get him through the desert. There's an Urnum from Rob, so it increases his clock more. Jorgo really needs to find some white mana, or a 4th mana. Rob's taking 1 and found a Chaos Orb. So I assume he's going to Chaos Orb the maze. Rob puts the orb in his graveyard. He flips Proxy. And he does. He's got the maze, so it's a hit. So he's going to be able to come in for 6 points of damage, bringing Jorgo down to 14. Rob's at 6, but he's done all of that damage to himself, so the pressure is not quite on him at this point. Jorgo's pausing in upkeep, or maybe the draw step. These webcam games, sometimes communication can be a little tricky. He's going to strip mine the Pendelhaven before Rob can use it for attackers. Rob swings with the elf anyway into the desert. Even his Pendelhaven is gone, but he has another elf to replace it. So Jorgo takes one from the elf and then kills him with the desert. And immediately plays the Felwar Stone and swords the Ernie. The good part for Rob about that is he's just turned the Urnam Jinn into another card, right? He drew an extra card with Sylvan Library, which he might not have been able to do had he not gained the 4 life. Jorgo is sitting on 4 mana for the first time. He has an Azure Drake. Wondered if it wouldn't be a Wrath of God there, if he thought 2 for 1 was good enough. Although his Desert was doing a fine enough job holding back both elves. There's Rob with the hymn that gets to Wrath of God, so maybe now Jorgo's a little sad that he didn't cast one of them, but those elves aren't really doing anything, so perhaps it's all going to work out. Jorgo takes 1 to Brain Geyser for 3. I think that was his last card in hand, so it's up to 3 cards. Rob with just the 1 now. Rob looks at his 3 cards from Sylvan Library, immediately plays a Badlands. When you're playing against the Sylvan Library, you love to see that. It means your opponent is probably Brainstorm locked, or in this case, Library locked with 3 duds on top. Neither player can really attack, given how close the life totals are. Rob with another Library there. And Jorgo has a Sarah Angel, so he attacks with the Azure Drake. Taking Rob to 4, he's got to find an answer to the Angel, or he's out, and he does not. So Jorgo takes the match, game number 3, and we'll move on to the finals. Speaking of the finals, we do have footage of that match between Jorgo on this blue-white control deck you saw today and Matthias on a white weenie deck. That match will actually go up on the Timmy Talks channel, broadcasted and commentated by Timmy himself, so check that out in the coming weeks when it goes live. If you would like to play some X-Points or get involved in the monthly tournament scene, head over to xpointoldschool.com where you can find information on the rule sets and the tournaments we run on Teleria. If you would like to be featured on our YouTube channel, head over to the Discord server or our Facebook page to get in touch with the media team and have your games presented on the internet. Don't forget to like and subscribe to this channel for more content just like this. And as always, thanks for watching.